Our next speaker this morning will be Jay Loyd. He's from Greenwood, Arkansas, and they attend the Wheeler Avenue Church of Christ in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And he has been an elder there for 11 years. He has his wife here with him, Lori, and he has 3 adult children, Ashley, Sarah, wedded to Aaron, and Ryan. They have 1 grandchild, Lewis. He's been a member of the church for 43 years, and he is a retired school teacher. And I love hearing a retired school teacher or school teacher period. They're usually some of my favorite speakers, so I'm really looking forward to this. And I asked him to sum up his sermon, which is about Job never giving up. And he said, Job is known from the scriptures for his patience. I would like to study what Job's patience looked like and identify lessons that will help us to understand patience better for ourselves and to be able to help others. Jay Loyd.
First of all, thank the brethren for the invitation to be here and for the opportunity to speak to you. I want to thank you for being here. A lot of times people have difficulty sitting through 1 sermon a week. You're going to sit through 4 in one day. And so you're to be commended. And it's encouraging to have you here and to see you here. And it's a blessing to me. And I appreciate Brother Mike's presentation. He told me he was going to set the bar real low so the rest of us could step over it. And I'm not going to worry about that bar. I'm just going to try to do what I can to show to you some truths about God's Word as it relates to patience. And we're going to look at Job this morning, and the text that we're going to look at is in James chapter 5, verses 10 to 11, where James says, "Take, my brethren, the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord as an example of suffering, affliction, and patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. You've heard of the patience of Job, and you've seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy." When James was writing to these people, they were going through some very difficult and through some very stressful times, and they were being challenged in their faith. And so, in admonishing them concerning patience, he holds up Job as an example. And we've all heard about the patience of Job. And I want us to understand this morning what the patience of Job really looked like. I know whenever I was growing up and I heard about Job, I had this idea there was just this rock of faith. He was just a quiet, stern, serene man, secured and anchored in all of his being in God, that when something bad happened to him, he just looked at it and said, "The Lord gives, the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." And whenever his wife told him, "Curse God and die," and then he says, "What? Shall we not receive evil at the hand of God as well as good?" And just impressed with that. And I thought that every time there was a trial, every time there was something to endure, we should just meet it with superhuman faith so that everybody around us could see how good and how sound and how perfect we were. And then I got to looking at Job. Job was a mess. Job was a mess. And the lessons that we learn about endurance and patience from Job is not so much what Job did, like Job had some secret formula for patience or endurance, but what we look at from Job and what James points out here is that whenever you hear of the patience of Job, you need to learn something, not about what Job did, but you need to learn about the Lord. That's where the source of patience and endurance comes from. That whenever we look at the patience of Job, it's not like we're trying to look at some secret formula that Job had, but we're going to look at the mess that Job was, and we're going to look at how that God was very pitiful and of tender mercy, to know that I have no reason to give up, because I have a God, and you have a God, that will never give up on you. And so no matter what trial might come our way, as in the case of Job, one day he's on top of the world and the next day the world's on top of him. Where within just a matter of a few days, his life, which was so good, became so bad. And it rocked Job in such a way that Job felt like all of the universe was against him. But he never gave up. Whenever we look at endurance, I want us to understand what patience means. A lot of times when we think of patience, we think, well, I'm going to the doctor's office and I'm going to sit in the waiting room and wait my turn. And you're sitting there and you're sitting there and you're sitting there and you're sitting there. Finally, they call your name and you go back. And well, that's patience. Well, that is patience, but that's not the patience that we're talking about today. Whenever we look at patience as it's defined in James chapter 5, to define our terms, James uses the words that talk about bearing up under injury, bearing up under trials, having endurance, being constant where you are in your relationship with God. And so this type of endurance is you going to the doctor's office and you're sitting in the waiting room and somebody's there cussing at you and just beating up on you, trying to get you to leave and go somewhere else and not go see the doctor. See, I'm not just sitting there in my quiet little bubble, rolling my eyes, waiting for them to call my name. I'm sitting there being abused. I'm sitting there being scorned. I'm sitting there being reproached continually, but I know what I need. And that's what endurance is. Endurance is not something that is nice and quiet and pretty and clean. I was looking for some pictures to put in here, and I typed in patience, and I got all of these serene pictures about people standing off up in the mountains, where everything was just really quiet and nice. Oh, isn't patience so beautiful? And I looked at that and I thought, that's not Job's life. That's not a picture of what Job was going through. Job was a mess. If we want some pictures of endurance, let's look at Hebrews chapter 3, where Paul talks about running the race with patience. So here he gives us an illustration of patience as it relates to an endurance race. Have any of you ever run an endurance race? Now, believe it or not, I have run one. I may not look like it, but I've run an endurance race. And at the beginning of the race, you're all trained and you're well fed and you're rested and you're stretched and you're ready to go, and then you take off, and then about halfway through, you start struggling and you start asking yourself, do I quit or do I go on? That muscle begins to hurt. Do I quit? Do I go on? Your mouth gets dry and you can't get enough saliva in your mouth to swallow and you can't catch your breath. Do I stop or do I go on? And then you look at the finish line as those people cross the finish line, and they look tremendously different from whenever they cross the starting line. Because endurance takes its toll. It's not pretty. Paul goes on to talk about the endurance of Jesus on the cross. He endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of God. He endured such contradiction of sinners. Think of Jesus on the cross. That's a picture of endurance. Think of Jesus whenever He was in the garden and He prayed, and His sweat was as it were great drops of blood because His agony was so great. That's what endurance and patience looks like. Listen to the words of Jesus as He was up on the cross and He cried out to His Father, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Jesus didn't just walk into the will of God. He didn't just go to the cross and calmly and serenely just take it as it came. But He was in conflict. "Father, if it be Thy will, let this cup pass from me." That's what endurance looks like. That's what patience looks like. And I think that that's important for us to understand. Whenever we encounter difficulty in our life, when we encounter our Job moments, we need to understand that how we respond is probably going to be a lot different from the way we think we would respond. You know, I like the saying from Mike Tyson. He's a boxer. Nobody's going to mistake him for a theologian or a preacher. But he was being interviewed by a reporter, and they were talking to him about his opponent. And he says, "Well, aren't you afraid of your opponent's plan?" And he just kind of grinned. He said, "Everybody's got a plan till you punch them in the mouth." And that's true. You know, I can sit here today, and I guess as we get older and we think of our mortality and we begin to think about life and the things that can come our way, we think about, okay, how would I handle that situation? But I've come to realize you don't really know how you're going to handle it. You don't really know how you're going to handle it. And we may have this plan of greatness, and we may have this plan of mega faith and ultra submission to God, but I don't know that when my Job moment comes, if I don't shake my fist at God and say, "God, this is not fair." How do I get through that? How do we help people get through that? You know, whenever I studied the book of Job, it changed my approach in counseling people and trying to help people that are going through their Job moments to have a greater understanding of what it is that they really need. And they don't need a preacher. They don't need somebody to try to correct their theology. They need somebody that can join them in their misery and their weeping to help them to get to where they need to be. And we'll illustrate that. Let's look at Job. This is what God says about Job, that there's none like him in the earth. That he was a perfect and an upright man. He was someone that feared God and he eschewed evil. And even after his first trial that he went through, he held fast to his integrity. This is a man of renown. These are God's own words. I would love for God to say that about me. Boy, there's just no one else like J. Loyd in this earth. And we look in Ezekiel 14, the prophet there, the Lord speaking to the prophet, puts Job in the company of Daniel and Noah, talking about his righteousness. And so he's held up with notable characters. And the thing about this is that whenever I see a man like this become the mess that he becomes through his trial, then I need to get real with myself too. And I need to be real in helping other people. That if somebody like Job, that there was no one else like him in the earth, that he was perfect and upright, and he feared God, and he shunned evil, he held fast to his integrity, and he was as righteous as Noah and Daniel. Listen to some of the things that Job says through his suffering. Job's first test, we won't take the time to go through all of it, but we know the story. We know how that Satan appeared before God and said to God, Job, he just worships you because you give him everything he wants. Who wouldn't worship you if you make him healthy and wealthy and give him this great life? That's why he worships you. God, Job's faith is suspect. But not only that, God, you're really not worthy to be praised. It's just what you do for people. And so he allows Satan then to test Job, and then he takes away his wealth. All of his oxen, his asses, his sheep, his servants, his camels, all of that's taken away. And then probably the worst news that a parent could get. Your kids. Your kids. The house fell in on your kids, and they're all gone. Imagine that. Think about this test. And here's the man. There's none like him in all of the earth. Fears God. We find in verse number 20 that he rent his mantle, he shaved his head, he expressed his grief, and he fell down and he worshiped God. Naked came I out of my mother's womb, naked shall I return thither. The Lord gave, the Lord's taken away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. In all this Job sinned not, nor charged God foolishly. What courage, what faith, what endurance. And Satan says, well, okay, we'll give him that. But you strike his health. That'll get him. And so God says, go ahead. Just don't take his life. And so Satan smites him with boils from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. And so he's sitting there, this miserable wretch of a man, taking an old broken pot and scraping the dead skin off of his flesh, and he's sitting there in a pile of flesh and ashes. And his wife comes up to him and says, do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die. And then Job says, you speak as one of the foolish women. What? Shall we receive good at the hand of God, and shall we not receive evil? In all this, Job did not sin. And so we look at the two trials of Job and we see the reaction, we see his response, one of worship, an expression of God's sovereign and supreme rule in his life. Those are verses that stand out to us. Those are verses that we will put on our walls. Those are verses that we'll embroider in pillows and put on our couches. We'll put them on Post-it notes and stick them up on the refrigerator. Because we want that endurance. Well, what are Job's next words? After that had taken place, Job sat in his misery, and he stewed and he marinated in his misery. And don't think for one second that Satan wasn't there working with him. Satan didn't say, well, I tried a couple of times and I couldn't move him, so I'm done, I'm moving on to the next. He didn't do that. Satan knew Job was a broken and weakened man. And he sat there. And even after those great expressions of faith and patience, endurance, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, you can imagine that in his mind he begins to think, now wait a minute. This isn't right. This isn't fair. What have I done to deserve this? You know, I look around and I see a lot of other people that are wicked, and they don't have these problems. And so he began to stew in that. And then his friends, his counselors, come to visit him. And they see him from afar off. And they looked at the wreck that he was. And they were so overcome that they couldn't speak. And they just went and sat for 7 days and mourned with him. And then Job breaks his silence. And when Job breaks his silence, he doesn't look at those 3 counselors and say, you know what, guys? The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord. No, his next words were, let the day perish wherein I was born. The night in which there was said that a man-child is conceived, let that day be darkness, let not God regard it from above, neither let the light shine upon it, let darkness and the shadow of death stain it, let a cloud dwell upon it, let the blackness of the day terrify it. Guys, I wish I had died when I was born, as if to say, I wish I had never been born. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever had people tell you they wish they had never been born? That's the way Job felt. He cursed the day of his birth. Look at these 2 expressions, and they present for us a dichotomy of Job. Here, an expression of the sovereignty and the supreme rule of God in his life. And over here, he's cursing the day he was born. This is something that we embroider on a pillow. You're not going to see this verse on anybody's pillow at home. You're not going to walk into somebody's house and look on their refrigerator and it says, I curse the day I was born. But you know what? The same guy that said the Lord gives and the Lord takes away is the same guy that said, I curse the day I was born. Endurance and patience is difficult. It's hard. It's ugly. It's messy. And we need to understand the reality of that in order for us to be able to help ourselves and to help other people. Job says in Job chapter 7 and verse 11, therefore I will not refrain my mouth. I will speak in the anguish of my spirit. I will complain in the bitterness of my soul. Job 10 and 1, my soul is weary of life. I will leave my complaint upon myself. I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. Job was not someone who just peacefully and serenely lived life saying over and over to himself, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. The Lord gives and the Lord takes away. But rather, he was someone who was in anguish of spirit. He was in bitterness of soul, and his life wore him out. Not only did he curse the day that he was born, but he wished for the day that he could die. He said in chapter 6, I wish God would just crush me. Just crush me now. Whenever we look at his disposition, I want us to understand that when we face Job moments, and whenever we're encountering people that have faced Job moments, be ready for some very challenging, for some very difficult, and for some very messy situations to help them to navigate through. Don't hold them and hold yourself up to this standard that we have. Well, if I'm the good Christian, I'll never question, I'll never doubt, I'll never say anything out of line. Because the one person that we're told to look to as an example of suffering did every one of those. Am I saying that's right? No, I'm not saying that that's right, and I'm not encouraging it. I'm just saying that's the way it is. And sometimes we just have to be real with ourselves and say that's the way it is. I might stand here today in the comforts of this building around all of these faithful people and I'll never say to God, God, you're unfair to me. Because I don't know what I would do when I got that call. And you don't either. Let's listen to Job's sentiments. As he talks about his experience, just a few verses. He says, "For the arrows of the Almighty are within me, the poison whereof drinketh up my spirit, the terrors of God do set themselves in array against me." This is how Job was really feeling. He says, the arrows of the Almighty are within me. In other words, God has just pulled back and He's just shooting arrows in me. And Job is taking all of these arrows. You know, like you see in the old Western movies where a cowboy gets shot with a bunch of arrows and he's staggering around like he's about to die. That's Job. That's Job. But not only that, there was poison on those arrows. And that poison is inside of him and it's drinking up his spirit. It's taking and sapping his life from him. That Job in his endurance was not experiencing just this overflow of life and goodness whelming up within him that sustained him. What he was experiencing was the life going out of him because of what he understood God to be doing with him. And he says, the terrors of God do set themselves in array against me. In verse 12 he says, I was at ease, but He's broken me asunder. Everything was going good. And then all of a sudden, pow! He breaks me open. He's taken me by my neck and He's shaken me in pieces. Job! Job is just sitting over here nice and quiet, enjoying life, and then all of a sudden it feels to him like God just comes in and grabs him by the neck and just takes him like this. He's shaken me in pieces. He's set His mark on me. God has set a target on me. You know, sometimes people feel that way. They look around and everything seems to be going good for everybody else, but it seems like God has just set a target on me. His archers compass around about me. He cleaveth my reins asunder and doth not spare. He poureth out my gall upon the ground. That's the vision of how ancient hunters would have an animal and they would encompass themselves around the animal and they would mass attack the animal and they would just come in and kill it and just go in and cut it open and all of its entrails would fall out. That's what Job was feeling. And I know I'm getting a little demonstrative about it, but I think it's important that we capture the experience that Job was going through. And not just put Job up on a pedal as this bastion of faith, that he was just able to just, with super faith, take everything that came his way, because he couldn't. He struggled, and he struggled mightily. And you know what that tells me? If Job struggled mightily, there wasn't another man on the face of the earth like him. He feared God in the same company with Noah and Daniel. Probably I'm going to do the same thing if I'm faced with that. And you're going to do the same thing if you're faced with that. And whenever we're helping other people that are going through those experiences, this is what we should expect of them. This is what we should expect. Job 19 and verse 11, Job says, He has kindled His wrath against me. He counteth me unto Him as one of His enemies. God, in all of His glory, has confirmed to us over and over again, as Mike demonstrated in his lesson, His love, His mercy, His compassion, His desire to save. But yet Job said, He counts me as one of His enemies. Job felt like an enemy of God. And so whenever we look at Job, it's important that we understand the distress that he went through. And we understand the inner turmoil that he was going through so that we can understand what true endurance looks like and get a real picture of that endurance so that we know how to counsel ourselves and to counsel others. Well, you know, it's bad enough to have hard times, but it's even worse to have terrible counselors. And that's what Job had. You know, Job's counselors were like we are a lot of times. You see somebody that's broken and miserable, what do you want to do? Well, you want to fix them. Because they're making us uncomfortable, right? When you're in the presence of somebody that's crying, what do you want to do? You want to keep them from crying because of the way it makes you feel. And that's the way the counselors of Job were. Here's this miserable, we've got to fix Job. And we know exactly what Job's problem is. Eliphaz says, Job, remember, I pray you, whoever perished being innocent? Or where were the righteous cut off? Even as I've seen, they that plow iniquity and sow wickedness, they reap the same. By the blast of God they perish, and by the breath of His nostrils are they consumed. And so here come his friends, and Job is wanting some understanding, he's wanting some mercy, and he's wanting some compassion. And Eliphaz says, Job, have you ever stopped to think about this? Good things happen to good people. Bad things happen to bad people. Really bad things happen to really bad people. Job, you're a really bad person. And Job's sitting there thinking, oh, great, thanks a lot. It's not only am I miserable, now it's my fault. It's my fault. The next counselor, Zophar, or rather Bildad, how long will you speak these things? Job is protesting. He's saying, that's not it, that's not it. And then Bildad says, how long will you speak these things? How long shall the words of thy mouth be like a strong wind? In other words, Job, all of your protest, you're just blowing wind. Does God pervert judgment? Do you think what you're going through is because God is unfair? That God is unjust? Or does the Almighty pervert justice? If thy children have sinned against Him, and He have cast them away for their... Oh, great, now bring my children into this. My children have died. And so now you're telling me my children died because they were terrible people also. You see, Job, here's your problem. If you would just seek God betimes, and you'd make supplication to the Almighty, if you were pure and upright, surely He would awake for thee, and He would make the habitation of thy righteousness prosperous. So Job, here's what you need to do. You need to just seek the Lord. Fellas, that's all I've done all my life, is seek the Lord. And you see where I am. There's nobody else like me in the world. I fear God. I eschew evil. And this has happened to me. Oh, but no, Job, something's got to be wrong somewhere. And you need to seek the Lord. And that'll fix your problem. And then the next counselor comes along and says, hast thou said, my doctrine is pure and I am clean in thine eyes, but oh, that God would speak. Job, you're saying you're fine and you're... I just wish God would talk to you. Because if God talked to you, then you'd get the message that He would open His lips against you, and that He would show thee the secrets of wisdom, and that they are double to that which is. Job, get this. God exacts from you less than your iniquity deserves. Job, you really deserve more than what's happening to you. Well, these are some friends, aren't they? So put yourself in Job's shoes. You lose your health, you lose your wealth, you lose your kids, you lose your family. You've got a wife standing over you saying, curse God and die. You've got 3 friends talking to you say, Job, you're a terrible person. You need to just seek God more. You need to just pray more. You need to read your Bible more. You need to study more. And when you do that, everything's going to be good. How comforting did Job find that? That's not comforting. In fact, what it does is that it creates an emboldenedness to want to fight out and lash out more. Because my wife's not on my side. My friends aren't on my side. All the people uptown, when I used to go uptown, I was the man. In chapters 29 and 30, and then he says, now when I go uptown, people look at me and they turn their head. They mock me, they scorn me. So the whole world turned against him. So who's going to stand up for him? Job does. And so then Job decides that he has a complaint. And he wants to take his complaint to the very top. He says in Job 23, 1-6, Then Job answered and said, Even today is my complaint bitter, my stroke is heavier than my groaning. Oh, that I might find him. Where's God? Where's God? That I might come even to his seat, and I would order my cause before him. I would fill my mouth with arguments. I would know the words which he would answer me, and understand what he would say to me. Will he plead against me with his great power? No, but he would strengthen me. Where's God? I want to talk to God. And when I get before God, I'm going to plead my cause, and I'm going to let God know where justice has been perverted, where things have been unfair. And when I make my cause towards him, he's going to strengthen me. In chapter 31, 34-35, Oh, that one would hear me. Behold, my desire is that the Almighty would answer me, and that mine adversary had written a book. Surely I would take it upon my shoulder and bind it as a crown to me. I would declare unto him the number of my steps. As a prince I would go near unto him. I want to see the Almighty. I'm through talking to you guys. I'm through talking to my wife. I want to go straight to the top, and I want to go to God, and I want to make my case to God. Because I've got some things that I want to say to God. Now, this is the man that feared God. This was the man that there was none like him. But what I want us to understand is that his misery and his pain and the lack of mercy and the lack of compassion was so great that it emboldened his spirit to cry out to God, to contend with God. You know, sometimes we hear people say, whenever they're in intense pain, you know, well, just the other day, I was talking to a Christian, and they said, I'm mad at God. Tears running down their face. I'm mad at God. I pray, and I pray, and I pray, and He doesn't answer me. And I look around at everybody else, and everything seems to be going great for everybody else, but my life is miserable. I'm mad at God. And when you're sitting there listening to that, that makes you uncomfortable. And you feel within you a need to defend. Oh, you should never say that. But we have to understand that when people are caught up in their Job moments, in the intensity of their miseries, they're going to lash out. And they're going to say things that they normally wouldn't say. Take Job, for instance. Take Job, for instance. Would Job ever have had the same attitude towards God were it not for the misery that he was going through? And so he cried out, I want to go to court with God. I want God to write down the accusation. He says, I want it written in a book. And that book that he's talking about is a book that was like a formal indictment that someone would take to court with them. And he says, I want you to give me that book, and I'm not going to be bashful about that book. I'm going to take that book, and I'm going to put it on my shoulder, and I'm going to wear it as a crown of my head, and I'm going to walk before God and say, okay, here's your charges. This is what I got to say about them. Because no one else will defend me. No one else will stand up for me. So God, here I am. And so then Job gets his wish. Be careful what you wish for. The Lord comes to Job out of a whirlwind and he says, who is this? First of all, he appears in a whirlwind. He doesn't come in with angel wings and rainbows and stars. And he comes in a whirlwind. And before he ever spoke a word, Job knew, uh-oh, I have said too much. Who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Gird up your loins like a man, for I will demand of thee, and answer thou me. Okay, Job, you want to come make a case? You got some questions to ask me? Before you ask yours, let me ask mine. Where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Oh, wait, you weren't there, were you? You weren't there. Where were you when I created the universe and the celestial glories? Where were you when I created the animal kingdom? Can you explain to me how all of those things work? And so Job immediately knew, I remember who God is now. I remembered the God that I feared. Because he says to him, in verse 4, chapter 40, after God goes through this litany of questions, just boom, 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 and Job is just, okay. And then God finally finishes, and Job says, I'm a vile man. What shall I answer thee? You've seen people like that. Maybe you've been a person like that. Maybe I've been a person like that. We're all geared up for a meeting and we're just going to march in and we're going to lay down the law and we're going to let people know how it is. And then we walk in and we realize we're the one that got it all wrong. It's humiliating, isn't it? Well, that's the way Job was. He was going to contend with God. But God said, you forgot something. I'm God. And you're not. But that wasn't enough. The Lord continues. He comes to him out of a whirlwind. Gird up your loins like a man. I demand of thee, declare unto me now. Will you disannul my judgment? Will you contend with me that you may be righteous? Hast thou an arm like God and canst thunder with a voice like him? And then he goes through and he says, look at the behemoth and look at the Leviathan. Can you contend with them? You can't even contend with them. What makes you think you can contend with me? And so then Job says, I know that thou canst do everything, and that no thought can be withholden from you. I abhor myself, and I repent in dust and ashes. See, if you were to graph Job's experience, chapter 2, he's up here, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord, and then it just crashes. I wish I had never been born. And then he begins to struggle, and then he begins to struggle, and then finally he gets his time and his opportunity with God, and then God makes him to realize, I'm the God that you feared way back then. And then Job says, I know you can do everything. I've complained to you, God. I've complained to you, and I've sought to contend with you, but now I understand that you're God and that I'm not. And then we know the closing of the story, that the Lord turned the captivity of Job. The Lord gave Job twice as much as he had before, and the Lord blessed Job in the latter end more than he did in the beginning. And so that's kind of an illustration of Job's endurance. And you're sitting there thinking, and we're supposed to endure like that? You see, when we look at the endurance of Job, it's not about us looking, okay, this is what Job did. And so we want to be like Job in our endurance. No, I think it's more, let's look at what Job did. Let's look at the struggle that he went through. Let's look at the battles that he fought. Let's look at how messy and how hard and how difficult it was for him, and how he was just ready to give up and die. But when he came out on the other end, the Lord was there for him. And that's the lesson that we're to learn. That Job never gave up, not because of Job, but because of God. Because the Lord. When he went before the Lord and the Lord said, where were you when I laid the foundations of the world? Job could have just said, I can never believe and worship a God that would do something like this. I could never believe and worship a God that wouldn't listen to me and understand my plight and my moanings and my misery. He didn't ever say that. But rather, he took his place again. And that's one of the lessons that we need to learn. First of all, is that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy. That's what James says. When you look at the endurance of Job, don't hold Job up. Hold the Lord up. Hold the Lord up. Job was a wreck. Job was a wreck. Job shook his fist at God. And God could have just looked at him and said, you know what? I've got enough people. I've got a big enough creation. I don't have to listen to this. Boop, you're gone. He could have done that. But he didn't. One of my favorite verses in the Bible, Psalm 103, 13-14. Like as a father pitieth his children, so the Lord pitieth them that fear him, for he knoweth our frame. He remembereth that we are dust. All of that bitterness, all of that complaining, all of that moaning, that was dust talking. That was dust talking. That Christian that I talked about that said, I'm mad at God, you know what? That was dust talking. You know what? God sees that. And God knows. That's dust talking. And He has pity. He has pity. Those of us as parents, I heard it once said that you've never arrived as a parent until your children tell you they hate you. Whenever your children told you, I'm not going to ask you if, but told you that they hated you, how'd you respond? Get out of my house, I'm going to get me another kid that loves me. No, that's a little kid talking. They don't know. They don't understand. They don't see the big picture. And that's the way it is with us. In our miseries, when we cry out to God, we may say things that sometimes are uncomely. And I'm not saying that it's right. I'm just saying that's the way it is. And God looks at that and He says, that's just the dust talking. And He's faithful. The Lord is faithful. If we're going to suffer according to the will of God and commit the keeping of your souls to well-doing as unto a faithful Creator. When do I need to know that God is faithful? When I'm on top of the world? Well, I need to know it all the time, but when is it the most important? When the world is on top of me. I need to know that God is faithful. And I need to choose to suffer according to the will of God. And suffering according to the will of God doesn't mean that I'm always going to say the right things and I'm always going to do the right things. But I suffer in a way committing my cause to God to fulfill His will and His plan and His purpose. We need to cultivate a faith for the great day of trial. Maybe your Job moment has come. I can't really look at my life and say I've had a Job moment. And Job, he even said, the thing that I feared the most has come upon me. And the thing that we need to understand is that we prepare for those days, not when those days come. That all of a sudden we run down to Barnes and Nobles and we grab all of the books that we can find on suffering to try to get through it. The day to prepare is right now. You see, when Job said, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord, that statement was the product of years and years of fearing and seeking the Lord. And we live in a world where we're subject to harsh realities. Bad things happen. And I don't want to be a Debbie Downer, but we've got to understand none of us are immune to it. Don't think that just because you're a Christian, God is going to shield you from things like this. In Romans 8, Paul says that we're all subject to the vanities of this life. Even those of us who are Christians, Paul says, we moan and we groan, looking forward to the day of redemption. But the things that happen to the bad people happen to the good people also. You see, that was the thing with the idea that the counselors of Job, we want it to be reasonable. And so it's only reasonable that, okay, bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people. There, the world is nice and orderly and we know how things work and we know what to expect. But it doesn't work that way, does it? That's what Job was saying. No, guys, it doesn't work that way. Because I see wicked people that are prospering and they're living a life of comfort and ease. And I see good people, i.e. myself, over here experiencing misery and sorrow and pain. It doesn't work that way. And you know what? It doesn't work that way. And whenever we're trying to talk to people and counsel them, we shouldn't try to come up with these little theological ideas that help them to try to make sense out of their suffering. The sense that they need to make out of their suffering and the sense that we need to make out of our suffering is we live in a fallen world. And bad things happen to everybody. But God is in control. Therefore, there is no reason for me to give up. That's it. You see, because whenever Job approached God, he didn't say to Job, okay, Job, let me explain to you why I did what I did. He didn't do that. He didn't give him a reason and an explanation so that Job stood before God. You know, okay, I got that now. I see it. I understand now. He didn't do that. He just said, he let Job know, I'm God. And you're not. And so we need to cultivate that type of faith. Proverbs 24:17, if you faint in the day of adversity, your strength is small. You know, and Job entered into his day of adversity with great strength. But he really struggled after that. Expect expressions of feelings of despair and anguish in yourself and others in time of great suffering. Address them appropriately. One of the things I did in school was I was a school counselor. And a lot of times I'd get kids sent to me. And they get sent to me because they said they wanted to kill themselves. And probably 99% of the kids that say they wanted to kill themselves didn't want to kill themselves. They were just very angry. They were very frustrated. They were very hurt. And they wanted to express that in the strongest terms that they could express it. And what stronger term can you use to say, I want to kill myself? And the point that I want to make is that sometimes when we're talking to people, they're going to use expressions that we may not be comfortable with. But we have to expect them and understand them because God does. And the best thing that you can say to a hurting person is, I understand. That person that says, I'm mad at God, I wouldn't want to say that. But I can understand why they would say it. And you know what? We go and we visit that person a few days later, and they backtrack that. And then they begin to go through all of the times that God had shown Himself faithful in their life. Because in that moment of anguish, there was an expression. Address them appropriately. There's a time to weep, a time to laugh, a time to mourn, a time to dance. Rejoice with those that rejoice. Weep with them that weep. If you're with somebody who's miserable, don't try to fix them. Just weep with them. Weep with them. Don't preach them a sermon. Weep with them. Don't try to discuss theology with them. Weep with them. Because that's a time to mourn. And that's a time to weep. And whether we realize it or not, there is great blessing that comes from mourning and weeping. We want to try to make it as short and clean as we possibly can. when in fact the reality is there is great blessing. And if I'm there weeping with them through their misery and their trial, when they get ready to start asking the questions, I want to be there for them. And I want to help to point them and show them in the direction. And then lastly, comfort and strength is not found in answers to all of our questions. It's found in knowing God is in control and He works all things according to His plan and His purpose. There's not an answer. It's not a sin when somebody asks you, why did this happen to me? It's not a sin to say, I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what events, but this is what I do know. I know that God is in control. And I know that God has a purpose and a plan. And if you don't give up, you can be a beneficiary of His blessing and His plan. And don't try to come up with all of the answers with these cute little formulas. Well, bad things happen to bad people, good things happen to good people, therefore you're a bad person. You need to repent, you need to study more, you need to pray more, you need to go to church more. A miserable person in their misery, a lot of times that's going to embolden them rather than comfort them. We know all things work together for good to them that love God and to them who are called according to His purpose. And so our final lesson is don't give up. Don't give up. Even when you think you've blown it. Oh, I said I'm mad at God. I've blown it. I've blasphemed the Holy Spirit. No, you hadn't blasphemed the Holy Spirit. Your dust is speaking. Your dust is speaking. God is so unfair to me. God is so unjust to me. Oh, I've blown it. No, you hadn't blown it. That's your dust speaking. Don't ever give up. I'll leave the lesson with you. I appreciate your attention and hope that the words that we've studied will cause you to stop and consider your response to suffering and how you respond to people who are suffering. And that we will all know ultimately that no matter how low, how hard, how bad it gets, no matter how far we feel we are from God or how far we feel like God is from us, He's pitiful, He's compassionate, so we should never give up. Thank you.